And what I'd really like to do is to welcome our guest speaker. And I do have you unmuted. And this is Dr. David Carless. And I'm going to put my spotlight via Zoom onto David. And David is a professor at the University of Hong Kong, and he's unit head of social context and policies of education. And what he's going to be talking with us today about is sustainable assessment practices in an online learning orientated world. So how are you, David, in this weird and wacky world?
I'm actually very well, thanks. And if you know the sort of recent history of Hong Kong, we've been having social unrest since November. So we've actually been in a form of lockdown since that time. So we've sort of had 6 months of teaching via Zoom and enhancing the online learning. But I should say that we don't have a strong traditional background in online learning in the way that you do, say, in Australia, given that Hong Kong is a very small space. So we've actually always been emphasizing, perhaps overemphasizing the face-to-face teaching. So although we've been doing it for 6 months, it is actually very new to us and our students. And we've all been kind of experimenting and sort of learning. So I'm sort of coming to this session with a sense of humility and hoping to learn from you guys as well as share a few things myself.
Sounds good. Do you find people are opening up to opportunities that this is presenting?
I think so. As I say, because we've been doing it since November, I think actually we are kind of in the second stage of getting used to it and trying to learn from other experiences and learning from our own experiences. And we've had a certain amount of student feedback that seems largely positive. But I think they sometimes struggle a bit when there seems to be a lot of sort of lecture and transmission via Zoom. And it seems that obviously enough, the more interactive kind of student-centered kind of approaches and showing sufficient sort of care and social presence and sort of flexibility, relational aspects, I think are some of the things that are coming out, and particularly flexibility in the assessment sphere, in that obviously what might have been previously a big exam in a hall will now generally be through a take-home exam with a more extended period, or through oral assessment. We've been thinking that if it takes a teaching staff maybe 15 minutes to mark an exam paper, whether a 10 or 12-minute oral assessment might be a reasonably good replacement for that. So yeah, a lot of new stuff, a lot of challenges, but I think we're, like everybody, trying our best to sort of grapple with the new realities.
Do you think there'll be this little shift across as well in perspectives, that people will be keeping, you know, when we return to what is the new normality, or the fluctuating normality, shall we say, because we don't know the outcomes with this kind of evolving pandemic. Do you think when people have the opportunities to come back into like a physical feet on the ground space, that there'll be a shift in them bringing some of that learning and some of those new ways into their kind of more regular workplace? Will it
I hope so, yeah. I hope so, but it's difficult to predict. I certainly for myself, I'm starting to realize that there are maybe some things that can be done in the online space that are actually perhaps more effective than with the face-to-face. I'm finding actually in my Zoom teaching, I'm actually getting even more contribution from the floor, from the students, actually because I could sort of see all their names in front of me on the screen. I'm sort of checking in with people saying, would you like to make a comment? Do you have a question? And they're very welcome to say, well, not really, I'm fine. But I find when I sort of interact with them, they are sometimes saying even more than what they've been saying in the face-to-face class. I'm not necessarily finding my students are engaging with the online readings and materials as much as I would like them to. But I guess that's possibly a common problem. Anything I can learn from you guys, sort of, who are probably more experienced in online teaching?
I don't want to keep being the person who hogs the floor. Joe, have you got anything to say?
Yeah, look, at UTAS, we've had a very interesting situation in the last few years where we've, due to basically funding issues, we've had a situation where all our traditional courses were pretty much taught traditionally, but we had a few very lucrative, fully online courses with high casualisation. So, you know, like 1,000 students really make a lot of money and subsidise everybody else. But they also did invest quite a lot in one particular degree, the understanding dementia, a Bachelor of Dementia Care, and then there was a MOOC that went with that also drove a lot of technological innovation, and all assessment was online as well, so no invigilated exams. And because it was a non-traditional cohort, they also did things like thought about assessment for learning, and also assessment that they'd have soft assessment so that you'd have like the opportunity to receive feedback as a student and then resubmit, and that was a way of ensuring retention and things like that. So what's happened with UTAS is we've got a new vice chancellor. We've been doing like a big transformation of where we do our courses, of our campuses. So 10-year plan of all just moving everybody, and at the same time, vice chancellor who hates exams because he's dyslexic and always failed exams, and did his law degree via no exams and did very well, but if he had to do an exam, he nearly failed the subject. So we've already, like all the new building designs are for no lectures anyway. They're all meant to be what we're calling lectorials. So in a sense, COVID-19 has just accelerated a process of having a really blended learning model for teaching and learning activities, but also thinking about assessment so that it's not putting people in a single space where you can look at them and give an exam which generally doesn't actually test the higher order cognitive skills or the technical, doesn't assess technical skills. And so even, you know, like this semester we are only having, I think, 79 invigilated exams instead of hundreds and hundreds. And so everybody who's a coordinator has been required to think of an alternative to an invigilated online exam, which has been very challenging for some, but really doing quite like I was listening to a paramedic academic talking about how they've run online OSCEs. It was hugely logistically difficult, but they did it. So yeah, I think for us, it's really about trying to transition from thinking about exams in a face-to-face context and then just doing the same thing but online, to saying actually it's way we need to think about different ways of assessing the learning outcomes. And honestly, part of it was cost. Like the cost of invigilated online exams is excessive, so they couldn't afford it.
Yeah, it's interesting with that notion. I know Max and I, from a learning design perspective, have mainly been approached. Well, we've had actually people very limited approach with assessment redesign at all. And the main kind of thing is just, okay, this is what we're doing in the classroom or with exams. How do we actually just do exactly the same thing online, and trying to, that's why I'm really interested now, once we get into David's presentation, is moving that beyond, as much as we're kind of trying to nudge it, that, okay, look at different ways of, you know, doing what that form of assessment and going back to what are your learning outcomes and how is that generating or providing opportunities to really reinvent what we're doing with assessment.
And I've just put in the chat a link. It's a secure one, so you might not be able to get it, sorry. But basically, like the team that I'm part of, we just trawl the internet, which is how I found virtual Cuppa. to see what are good ideas for alternative assessment, and now we're starting to focus on what are good ideas for engaging students in an online environment, and we're just curating them and putting them on a website for staff to have a look at and say, okay, this might work for me, that might work for this unit. Yeah.
Going back to Alison's point for a second, I think to some degree the issue that we're having at Melbourne is the whole COVID-19 thing was a sudden change. Melbourne, of course, is a face-to-face institution. So having a number of academics, well, everybody, having to change to the online environment, right now they're only thinking about how do I transfer that face-to-face to online. I'm very much hoping that as time progresses, that will evolve a little bit and become, how do I do things better online than I could be doing them face-to-face? But again, that's going to come down to whether or not the university declares early whether or not we're going back to face-to-face or whether we're staying online for semester 2. I think the more time that's given to academics to think about this, the better chance that we'll get something a little bit more unique.
I'm also interested in just the equity issues and how, like I was reading an article today, I think it was in Times Higher Education or something, but they were basically saying that the high-end elite universities, like in Melbourne, they were talking about Harvard and that, it's not really about the teaching, it's about the on-campus experience and the networks that you create and the parties that you go to and all of that stuff. And that really equity means we need to think about what we give all our students, and online is actually very good for equity in some ways because anyone can access it any time, but it's also quite bad for equity because it highlights where people don't have good internet access, where they don't have like their own room where they can work. And you can almost see that played out in terms of colleagues. Like I was talking to someone the other day who's doing her online teaching in her 6-year-old son's bedroom because her mother-in-law from South Korea is trapped in Australia and can't go home. So she's got the study, and then, and it makes it harder, much harder to teach.
Yeah. So I'll hand it over to you, David. I'm really interested, particularly from the assessment, sustainable practices as well in terms of education.
Yes. Okay, so can you see my slides?
Definitely.
Okay. So basically, in my Twitter account at Carless David, I've been kind of talking about these kind of issues of assessment in online environments, feedback in online environments for the last probably 5 or 6 weeks ago. And the title Alison proposed suited me very well, Sustainable Assessment in Online Learning Environments, because it made me come back to an article that I particularly enjoyed reading in the first half of my career. That was David Bowd's classic article in 2000 about sustainable assessment. The idea that assessment needs to meet the needs of the present without compromising the needs of the future. Assessment for lifelong learning, as it were. And in this article, he tries to tease out some of sustainable assessment elements and aspects. And I think some of the features would be familiar to all of us in terms of self-assessment, engaging with criteria and rubrics, or co-creating rubrics, applying rubrics to examples of student work or other artifacts. And then the idea of peer feedback, the idea that students can learn a lot from composing peer feedback, that peer feedback integrates very well with self-assessment, and that peer feedback can enable you to judge your own work better. And perhaps I will pause on the next slide, which is trying to suggest some specific examples of potential online assessments. One of the features of sustainable assessment, obviously, is in preparing you for lifelong learning, including work, the workplace. So these are some examples, just a few examples of some potential assessment tools that could be practicing the kind of skills and capacities that one would need both for the workplace and lifelong learning. Using Wikipedia as an assessment task, that there's a kind of realism in updating or revising a Wikipedia page. And in the current context, if we can imagine medical information, there's even more an onus on the medical information on Wikipedia or elsewhere being very up-to-date, very accurate, not spreading any misleading kind of information. And then the idea of simulations, digital simulations. So the example here, Wei et al. Was done at University of Queensland in business, and it was occupational health and safety, and the simulation was about some kind of accident that had happened, and the participants got kind of phone calls and inputs, and they had to try and solve these problems. And then another recent example is some work around assessed blogs, where the researchers looked at how in different disciplines students could be writing blogs about their responses to lectures or to tutorials or the teaching material and content. So I think I'll pause there, but I've just tried to give a bit of an overview of authentic assessment as being something that doesn't rely on the teacher to immediately make all the judgments, that students are involved in making judgments for themselves, with peer feedback, with self-assessment, applying criteria, and that there are various ways going beyond the traditional exam in which students could have some choice and flexibility to illustrate how they are meeting the learning outcomes of the course. So perhaps, Alison, if I'm out, I'll pause there and welcome comments, questions, or additional ideas.
I'm wondering, with what makes an assessment task authentic?
Well, there are various frameworks in the literature. I think realism is probably one of the keys, that there is some kind of realistic resemblance to the real life applications of the disciplines. It's unlikely to be exactly the same. However rich your simulation, it's still a simulation. It isn't going to exactly duplicate the real thing, but it's going to resemble the context and the participants. Maybe I could give an example. In my recent research about 8 or 9 months ago, I actually went to the hospital and I followed the students doing their bedside rounds. So it was a group of 7 students, and they were accompanied by their teacher and myself as the researcher. And they were examining the patients in the real context of the hospital. But because they are students, they were not fully responsible. So they were doing the examination, but the doctor stroke teacher from the university was with them, and she could coach them, she could demonstrate, she could verify the extent to which their diagnoses were on the right track or accurate. She asked a lot of questions, so there was a lot of on-the-spot discussion. So there was realism in terms of context and participants, but it wasn't truly authentic in that the student medics were not fully autonomous, and if they did miss out something, the teacher would intervene to help the role. And obviously it was unusual in the sense that there were a number of students observing, and I was there as a researcher. I think also maybe part of authentic assessment involves the evaluative judgments of the participants, that they're involved in forms of peer and self-assessment, and that they're trying to derive some authentic learning from the situation. I think that would be my attempt at a summary.
Thank you. Any other questions while we're pausing here for a moment?
I was just going to jump in and say that you've got some really interesting, some interesting suggestions there for online assessments. We've made use of assessed blogs, for example, in a few subjects that I've worked with, and that seems to work quite well. A couple of others that we've introduced are things like infographics, having students develop an infographic, which is not dissimilar to the science approach of creating posters, I suppose. And again, it brings in a number of skills, and it helps students see how their learning articulates to a post-education environment as well. Short video presentations we've used as well, and things like digital timelines. So there's a number of different ways we've incorporated things, particularly into the history and philosophy areas, but others as well.
Yeah, and I think a lot of these tasks also, they really seem to lend themselves for working in partnership and collaboration and building those skills amongst students. What do you think?
Absolutely. One of the things that I'm very much hoping to do once we're back into a face-to-face environment is incorporating some cross-disciplinary work there, where you might get media studies students filming presentations that have been scripted by, say, a history student about a particular historical event. And then you've got two pieces of assessment that have come out, one for the media students, one for the history students, but having them work together and learn that need to work with experts in other areas.
Back to you, David.
Max, with your video presentations, how did you engineer some interaction around them? Was there some peer feedback, or was there some kind of interaction?
In the particular case that we did here, it was actually for a capstone history subject. So it was right at the end of their degree. And students had the opportunity to choose from a variety of different ways of delivering their information. So one was video, another was blog, another was create websites. One student did an oral presentation using wooden spoons, believe it or not, which went really well. But no, the idea there was that the academics would assess the video presentation, but the students were informed very early on that it was not about the quality of the video that they would be being marked on. It was about the content of the video, so that they could do this on an iPhone if they chose to, or they could borrow more high-end equipment from the university if they had an understanding of how to make use of that. So it wasn't about the quality of the video per se, and that's why I say in future what I'd like to do is have digital media students involved in this sort of process, so that you've got them doing the filming and they're being assessed on their technical ability to do the filming, to get the audio right, to do the editing. But the history students, for example, would be providing the content, the backdrops, the presentation element, and that way they're being assessed on the content and the other students are being assessed on the technical skill of being able to produce that material.
Yeah, that was one of the challenges I faced in December when, because of social unrest, my face-to-face teaching suddenly switched to online, in that normally I would have had my students do 5-minute oral presentations in class, and then we would have had a discussion around them, and I could draw out some points from each presentation that was relevant to the rest of the class, and also by observing what the others were doing in their research proposals, there would be benefits. So as an emergency replacement replacement for that. They just sent me their 5-minute video online. So and under that emergency situation, they won't be able to get that sort of learning from others that they would have had in the class. Do you see any way around that?
Yeah, that's a good point. And certainly in the capstone, the idea was we had a full day symposium, if you like, or exhibition of everybody's work at the end of it. So the student would actually be co-located with their video or their website, and we would have staff and students wandering through the exhibition space, looking at, listening to these videos. So they were certainly getting feedback from a much wider group than just the academic doing the marking.
Okay.
Yeah, I've done something kind of similar, albeit it was a few years ago now, but instead of them actually, these was all online, an international cohort of students. It was only a small group and it was a research subject. So it was easier to tailor it, but it was the same, exactly the same really as what Max is saying happened there, but they were virtual. We did it through the LMS basically, and it was asynchronous. So you could go in and watch these videos. It was so that it was a bit of like peer-to-peer teaching. So because they had to learn about 12 different methods, but basically find something that they were really interested in, that they presented it. And it was only an 8-minute presentation via video with their audio over the top. And then they had to peer review at least 2 others that were different. So if one was doing discourse analysis and someone else was doing grounded theory, they could peer review each other because they were from using different spaces. But there was a basic template. It was kept pretty simple, as in 250 words, but it was quite structured so that everybody had an opportunity to learn how to actually deliver feedback and be able. It was assessed, but it was more assessed as in as long as you had conformed to kind of the template basically with your feedback. It wasn't about, and you also had to, part of it was you had to pick out what you thought was the best feedback that you received, not that as in it was the highest kind of rating that you got, but the most valuable feedback that you could move forward and really develop what you were doing. This was kind of an ongoing process. So there was 3 stages with this assessment. So that feedback was going to be invaluable from their peers, and also from me as a lecturer, that they could apply as they moved forward. So I think this space, whether you're on campus or fully online, it's just as doable. It's just a different means of how you actually incorporate it.
Yeah, I think the reason that assessment is so difficult is encapsulated on this slide. In that Bowd 2000 Sustainable Assessment article, he coined this term double duty to illustrate the multiple functions and purposes of assessment. And I think this is the crux of why assessment is so difficult, because we've got the formative, we've got the summative, we've got the certification, we've got the accountability function of assessment. And in his sustainable assessment paper, he's introduced the idea of assessment for lifelong learning. So there are so many things that assessment is trying to accomplish. It's no wonder that it's very problematic and very challenging, in that different individuals may be more focused on one or more of these elements. And it may be from the student point of view, sometimes they may be thinking, well, I just want to get the degree, I just want to pass. While others may be thinking, really, I want to get some very rich feedback. So perhaps it's only through communication and negotiation and trust that we can try to grapple with these ideas. But perhaps if I may come on to feedback, which is one of the things I've probably done most of my work on in the last 5 or 6 years. And following Bowd's sustainable assessment idea, we did an interview study of some teachers who'd won awards for teaching excellence. And we used this term sustainable feedback to try to encapsulate the idea that perhaps the best teaching helps the students to learn for themselves and to be independent, and that actually the best feedback probably makes the feedback provider redundant by enabling the students or facilitating them to learn for themselves, to self-regulate. And I think we found in this research two groups of teachers. One group who had a fairly traditional, conventional view of feedback as something that the teacher provides, they're coaching, they're sharing ideas, they're giving a lot of good personalized feedback to students. But the other group in the sustainable dimension were more focused on how we can teach students to become independent, how we can hone their self-evaluative capacities, how we can enable them to do peer feedback better, and some of the practices in which sustainable feedback manifested itself was often when there were multi-stage assignments, when you could maybe have a draft, then an outline, then some feedback either from the teacher or from peers. And then students could get the experience of working with feedback and improving over time. Peer review, student peer review was often a part of it, and using the technology through synchronous or asynchronous discussion forums, using wikis, using Google Docs to enable students to work in teams and to access and use feedback. And again, perhaps I'll pause on the online applications aspect, in that in the last few years, there's been a lot of interest in audio feedback and video feedback. Perhaps in the literature, more of teacher-provided audio feedback and teacher-provided video feedback. But following the sustainable feedback line, I tend to think it's even more productive if it's the students who are producing the audio and the video feedback. Because when the students produce peer feedback, they're involved in a very rich cognitive process, if they engage with it and if they do it well. Because they've got to diagnose, they've got to analyze the strengths and weaknesses of somebody else's work. And through this process, if it works well, they're going to get some insight that they can apply to their own work. Because I think when we engage in peer feedback, we are not only thinking of the performance of the peer, but we're also relating it to our own work. And I remember a few weeks ago on the virtual Cuppa, you had Phil Dawson on, and there was some conversation around peer review in academia, and that actually peer review in academia is a more effective sequence and cycle than it is in undergraduate education. Because in academia, we are always required to show and demonstrate how we've run with the peer review that we've had. We've got to compose the letter to the editor that says, well, reviewer 1 said this, reviewer 2 said this, and this is how I've tried to revise the draft to show engagement with the feedback. And I think if we could try somehow to duplicate those kind of processes in the undergraduate and postgraduate sphere, so that there is a kind of rebuttal function, that you explain why you've acted on some feedback. So we need more of these cumulative assessment designs or e-portfolios, curated e-portfolios, collaborative writing, where actually students can show how they've processed, engaged with, and used feedback. Because obviously the proof of the feedback pudding is in the use, not just the reception. Perhaps I'll pause there for comments and questions again. Oh, William's gone.
Alison, you're muted.
Oh.
Okay.
Oh, maybe she was muted.
Oh,
sorry.
I was, David. I was
for a while, Alison.
I hadn't unmuted me. Is with this, I know you're kind of probably going to get to this, but this notion of actually potential workload savers, which initially for me, with that little one that I was talking about, where it was like a short video presentation that was shared via a discussion board. It was all online, and students were learning how to give each other valuable feedback, but be critically reflective thinkers in what they were doing. So it was kind of this double-edged, and it was very uncomfortable. And I think the biggest learning curve came once those students, they were master's students, finished the subject I was teaching and went into the next. I then got emails coming back and saying, oh, gee, we actually were able to, what we learned and to be able to do those things, we really applied very well in the next. So they didn't really recognise their skills until they were applied. So this has made me think about, in terms of sustainability for both me as a lecturer as well, it actually it reduced my workload. I had, and I did it again in a class where I had about 290 students, and there was just me, and it was online, and it turned into a sustainable workplace practice for me to actually go the distance to actually build capabilities of students to be able to peer review, that they then carried on as they developed their coursework and moved through their masters, because this was an early subject as well. So that notion of sustainability, I think also can be stretched across into being a sustainable working life for us as educators, but also students learning that, applying those capabilities to their next subject, and applying it once they're actually out in the workforce, because they're actually aware of the skills that they're starting to build.
Yeah, I think because of the way higher education is structured, there is always a lot of assignments that come at the end of the course. And it seems to me by the end of the course, it's too late for feedback. I think at the end of the course, we have to grade and mark and perhaps give a brief comment. But I think where there's a lot of unproductive teacher marking or grading time, it's at the end. So I think we've got to somehow flip the feedback or flip the sequence somewhat, so that there is more discussion, more peer feedback, more illustration of what good performance looks like during the process, and then correspondingly less at the end. I've done quite a lot of research that has interviewed students about their experiences of feedback, and they really don't appreciate very much at the end, because they're thinking, well, why are you telling me now? Why didn't you tell me this earlier? So actually, the more we write at the end of the sequence can actually be quite frustrating to them. And there's a lovely quotation from a study in the UK, where the students said the end of semester feedback was a perversely belated revelation of things that should have been made clearer earlier. So I think if we can try to sort of front load the feedback a bit more, and by the time it's finished, it's grading. It's not feedback. It's too late for it. And students only want feedback if they can use it in order to improve the grade. Once they've got the grade,
I would say we all only want feedback if we can actually use it.
Yeah.
Students.
Yeah. So. But unfortunately, the way higher education is structured, with a lot of exams, a lot of things at the end, there's a danger that teaching staff are doing quite a lot of unproductive work.
So is this also I'm wondering about this conflation of feedback being kind of subsumed under assessment as well, and whether assessment equals grades. We're so much into that way of thinking that we have had an explosion in how many assessments we're doing as well. So I'm wondering about your thoughts in terms of how do we actually have sustainable working practices for both student and for the academic, in terms of, is there just too much that's graded assessment, or is there too little feedback? What's the mix? How do we get a balance in fulfilling grading, but sustainable assessment practices as well?
So, yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I think modularization was introduced for good reasons, but I think that with every unit and every module having their assessment, we do have a problem of assessment overload and over-assessment. And Tony Harland from the University of Otago has written very interesting stuff about this topic, and he calls it the assessment arms race, that there is just an overload of assessment. Some of the English universities have tried to tackle this through what they call program-based assessment, and some of them are trying to think how they can maybe put 2 or 3 units together and make them a larger unit with less assessment but more sort of process as it goes through unit to unit. So program-based assessment is worth having a look at, but maybe trying to get a more integrated, coherent assessment approach across a whole program. I think there's a danger that teaching staff are just doing their own thing in their own unit sometimes, and getting together and working out how one assessment builds on another. I also think if we want students to use feedback, they should have more opportunities to rework an assignment. If you think, following our academia analogy, if you imagine a journal article for us, sometimes we could be working on it for 18 months or longer, and then we might submit it to one journal and it gets rejected, and then we might relook at it. So we might have been working and reworking, getting peer review from our colleagues over a very extended period of time. While for students, it seems it's almost like a one shot that they do in a rush before the deadline and then it's finished. So I know it's difficult, but I just wonder if we could find some ways in which, through maybe curated e-portfolios or some other system, that students actually could be revisiting their work. Sort of in Shakespeare 101, could you be doing something? And then in Shakespeare 102, could you be taking the same assessment or assignment and enriching it and revising it so that students get more of the habit of revising, reworking? Because I think that can actually be more satisfying when you can actually revise and upgrade. And you can actually see how you're using feedback. Could that be done in the arts, Alison?
Yes, well, I'm thinking even we begin with learning outcomes in learning design, and how many times do you actually need to graded assess a learning outcome? Sorry, Joe's jumping in. Go, Joe.
Well, it's just it's very topical for us at the moment. So we had a special meeting yesterday because we were asked about the assessment procedure for the University of Tasmania includes something saying, where practicable, provide students with at least 2 summative assessment opportunities to demonstrate that they've met the intended learning outcomes of the unit. And that's one of the drivers for a bit too much assessment, because how do you manage to test and give students the opportunity to demonstrate that they've attained it twice? And that links as well to the idea of, the belief that students won't do something unless there's a mark attached to it. So how do you design your assessment so that you've got the opportunity as a student to try once against the ILO, and then if you don't meet it, you get the feedback from the first assessment task, and then you've got an opportunity. So one of the things that we talked about was that's where you can provide more formative assessment, and you have to articulate to the students why that's important and that they get the feedback and then they can get the marks. But the problem that we identified is that, like, we've pretty much got a constructive alignment. It's pretty established at our university, and every unit that's designed has to have intended learning outcomes, and they have to be able to demonstrate alignment to the assessment tasks, and that, they're covered. But the thing that is not done is, if you think of an ILO, there's criteria for what a student has to do to demonstrate that they've met it, which is almost independent of the assessment design. But what we do is we tend to have the ILOs, we think up an assessment task and go, yeah, that one kind of does ILO 2 or a bit of ILO 2 and a bit of ILO 3. And often what can happen is a student might fail a really important component of a single ILO, even though they meet the achievement levels for other components of that ILO. And so we're trying to think, or to encourage people to think about, what are the criteria, like what does achievement of that ILO look like? What criteria would you have? And to just check that the criteria are actually embedded in the assessment design so that the students have the opportunity to meet the criteria twice for each ILO, rather than just meet the ILO and you kind of fudge it a bit, say, and ignore the fact that actually it's only, you know, this assessment task is all about communication, and then you've pinged it to 3 ILOs which have communication components, but you actually don't have something pinned to the other part of that ILO. So that's, I mean, we kind of went, our staff aren't up to that. So it's kind of like something in the future. But we did recognise that the problem isn't so much, it is that, you know, students do the assessment task, they get some feedback, but the next assessment task doesn't necessarily enable them to build on that feedback. It's also that the way we approach assessment, we don't really think about a systematic, holistic approach to making sure the components are met. But there's one, I'll just add this quickly. There was one example. There's a guy who teaches programming, and he has decided that if you meet the criteria for an ILO or ILOs in an assessment task at a pass level, you then, it's like you've met it and you've passed the course, the unit, and then you've got the opportunity to do more. And so the rest of it is all about the quality and the level and depth of achievement that you get. And so he has students who can do a pass amount of assessment, and then if they want to, they can do more, which seems to work really well.
Yeah, I think a lot of this also ties in with what David's been talking about with the sustainable assessment practices and authentic assessment design. So coming back into an authentic assessment design kind of area starts to, and just from my background in terms of looking at how we frame things in different language, when you say measure and then you say observe, you can measure an observation, but it's very hard to observe a measurement. And that notion of tying feedback or assessment into, so those abilities with those learning outcomes to actually observe a student being able to do the doing, not necessarily for every subject that it needs to be a graded assessment, but aspects of them have to be observable. And there's other aspects that are more easily evaluated through measurement. Creating kind of that balance rather than it being very strongly pushed towards to measurement in terms of evaluation as well. So I think some of these things would actually just naturally be addressed if we moved more. It's a continuum really in terms of authentic assessment design, from the traditional to the really extreme, but pushing people at least past, if it was a scale of 1 to 10, at least past the 5 mark to come up to be into authentic assessments. So I think a lot of things that we're trying to argue for and everything actually comes down to much more evolved form of assessment design. I'm just checking how much time we've got. We've got about 5 minutes. And what I always say is we can hang around talking after this by all means, but I usually just cut it off at the 1 hour mark if people aren't here and want to watch it. It's hard enough to watch anything for longer than 20 minutes at the best of times.
Sure.
So back to you, David.
I've spoken quite a lot. I just wondered if anybody else, I mean, we've had a lot of great points from Joanne and Max and you, Alison. Is there anybody else there who'd like to join in the fun and make a comment?
So what I might do if people aren't commenting just yet is what I did at the end of another one was actually just to grab you and say, just have a quick think about a key takeaway, something that you've gone, this has really made me think about this, and I'm going to go back to my workplace and try this or do something that's come up. So, and this is where I just grab a name. So I'm going to go right down to the bottom of my little screen and say, Narelle, what are your thoughts? What's a key takeaway for you?
Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yep.
Oh, good. I'm one of the ones that's sharing a room at the moment with my 15-year-old son doing school, so that's all fun. I'm from the Assessment Research Centre at the Melbourne Graduate School of Education, and I'm actually doing a PhD.
You're a little hard to hear. Maybe just
has it gone now? Oh,
that's
okay.
good there.
Okay, hang on. What I'll do is I have to flick over to my... Okay, I should be coming through my headphones, but it doesn't look like I am.
You're good now.
Yeah, that's good.
I'll just get down to my computer level. There we go. So I'm from the Assessment Research Centre, and I'm doing a PhD in formative assessment, and I teach teachers how to write rubrics and assessment and learning progressions. So I have an online course where I'm teaching teachers about this, and I think the sustainable one is one that has captured my attention, because I get the teachers to, I use a weekly discussion forum where they have to do a lot of peer assessment of each other, not assessment, sorry, just peer feedback to each other. And I always force them a little bit uncomfortably. They tell me in my SES results, but at the start, but then by the end, they're quite happy about it. Force them to post some of their, what they've learnt that week online and comment on each other's. And they tell me quite often that they hate doing that until about week 5, when I give them something quite concrete in the form of a rubric with levels of quality within which they can draw on to then takes away their own feelings of what they're, because they're only just starting to learn it, and it sort of gives them something concrete that they can use the feedback. And that over the years I've been doing this because Melbourne University does have some online courses, and mine went to online about 5 years ago through what was then called what's now called MSpace. But I had the luxury of having quite a long time to think about how to design the course. And what I noticed was that when I sort of used something concrete for people to give feedback to each other, it was quite structured in the form of a rubric. The spike in peer feedback that week went from, like, say 50 posts to like 250 posts. So in terms of sort of sustainability, really building those structures whereby students can scaffold each other. Because of my first course had about 15 students, and now it's up to 115. But anything you can do to sort of build students to scaffold each other is, I think, works towards sustainability. That's what I found.
By the sounds of, I mean, you're really reducing that fear of failure. Basically, there's a scaffold, literally a metaphorical one,
yeah.
But something that's giving me some framework. I'm not going to look foolish. I'm not going to do this wrong. We're all kind of now know how we can all be a bit similar. So I think some of those things are great in terms of building students' sense of self-efficacy. Yeah,
so the rubric that I gave them to give peer feedback to each other was tightly linked to what they were learning and what they actually were posting, so that they had something, they felt more comfortable with that, I think, rather than just sort of very sort of random comments that were linked to more, general comments like "that's great" or "I don't understand that," to really, I'd already built in the levels of quality in terms of using sort of like a taxonomy, so that it was very, very much directed to their work rather than those personal sort of feelings.
Narelle, can I also ask you, did you scaffold them in to develop their capabilities to actually use the rubric as well, or did you just put it there and it was a link they could click on?
Well, it's a course on rubrics, so they had done a lot of reading about it. So yes and no. I would say that they'd read a lot about it and they were writing rubrics themselves. So that's how they sort of came down.
So, and that's one I completely agree with too, is this idea of multi-stage assessments. But as working in the curriculum design section now, I'm finding great difficulty convincing academics to go down that road. And a large chunk of it seems to be due to wording in the assessment policy at the university that says you can't mark the same thing twice, or the same thing can't be submitted for assessment twice, which, although I disagree that that's actually what you're doing when you create a proper iterative assessment, that's the concern that the academics always fall back to. So rather than building the students up to a final piece of work, they're concerned that, well, that's marking the same thing more than once. David, do you have any comments or ways that, you know, I can convince people that that's not the case?
It's a tough one, isn't it? I mean, could it be that the assignment has a series of stages so that it isn't the same? It has some additional parts. So imagine in a research course, you might have your literature review, and then you might then add your research method as the next stage. But you could also revise and update your literature review, and then add the research method. So you formulated it as a second assignment that builds on the first one. I don't know if that would work.
That's kind of where I've been going. For one example would be write an introduction, you know, get that out of the way. But the problem is if you then include the literature review or the introduction in the final piece of work, then it's considered to be being marked again. So,
but you also raise the issue of we have a lot of myths around procedures, and quite often staff will say you're not allowed to do X, but actually they can't actually give the evidence for it. And if you talk to the senior manager, they will say, well, of course you're allowed to do that. So it seems that assessment is such a contentious and threatening kind of issue that we often get bogged down in what you can do, what you can't do. But I think the very best teachers always put the students' interest first, and they will do what is good for the teaching, good for the learning, and good for the students. And certainly I found that in my research into excellent teachers, that they wouldn't worry too much about what the regulation said. They would do what they believed in and what they thought the students would learn from. And the students very much welcomed this, that there has to be some kind of flexibility, I think, in good assessment. And I suppose the concept of double duty implies that good assessment involves the art of compromise and trying to maneuver one's way through all these complexities.
Nicely put, thank you.
Yes. Well, that's really good. Sorry?
Can I just make a quick
Hi,
comment
Narelle.
about that too? Yeah. So that course I was explaining, it is iterative, and they do get a lot of feedback from each other and from the one tiny little portion.
Sorry, Narelle, we're having trouble hearing you.
Oh, sorry. Is that better?
Yeah.
I have to get very close to my computer. So the other thing was that, you do the formative assessment, and I think it does work, and then you get told you give too many H1s, which is a problem as well.
Yeah, completely agree, Narelle.
Closing remarks, David.
Well, thank you very much, everybody, for interacting. I suppose if I had to try to sum up, I think in the current context, I would be talking about sort of humanism and sincerity and trust and care, and allowing students some flexibility to demonstrate the learning outcomes in different ways. And perhaps we have to be a little bit less procedural in the current climate to accommodate for the different situations that students may find themselves in. But I think the overall aims of good sustainable assessment and good sustainable feedback would be that we are trying to develop the lifelong learning skills amongst the students, and that good quality peer feedback and well-motivated student self-assessment can play a part in those roles. And I think perhaps we as educators can try to model some of these processes for the students, and maybe explain to them and exemplify the role of peer review in our work, and how we are always trying to self-evaluate our own performance, talking with peers, talking with colleagues for the purposes of lifelong learning.
On that note, thank you very much, Professor David Carless.
My pleasure.